In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in rural Ohio. He suddenly heard his bedroom door creak open. Now, he was used to this sound. He figured it was just his great-grandparents, the people he lived with, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. And so, he's a little kid. He just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. But he could hear the distinct sound of footsteps making their way across his bedroom. He heard the old floorboards groaning under someone's weight. And then, the footsteps stopped right next to his bed. The silence was heavy. Curious, the little boy couldn't help himself. He slowly, carefully, opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, and what he saw standing over him was not his great-grandparents. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet 2-lane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was the kind of place where towns were small and separated by vast stretches of farmland. It was peaceful, predictable. As Linda drove, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the empty fields. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband, Jack, owned in a nearby town. It was a place they had built together, a source of pride for them both. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This path led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. It was their sanctuary, a place far removed from the noise of the world. She parked her car outside their old, charming farmhouse. Before getting out, she reached into the back seat and grabbed a vinyl deposit bag. It was heavy with the cash and checks from the day's sales at the pizza shop. She stepped out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside washed over her. The farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any passing cars or the distant sounds of neighbors. The only noises were the gentle bleating of their sheep in a nearby pasture and the familiar intermittent buzz of power tools coming from the barn. Jack was working on something again. She walked around to the back of the barn, and sure enough, there he was. Jack was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, his hands covered in grease. He and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, it felt different. It felt right. She truly believed he was her soulmate. Jack was a man who couldn't sit still. In addition to co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also worked a full-time job at a local manufacturing plant. And on top of all that, he had a side business restoring classic cars. It was his passion. So it was no surprise to Linda to find him out here, tinkering with an engine as the sun went down. Sitting in the grass right beside the car, playing with a heavy wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda approaching, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, scrambled to his feet, and ran over to her, wrapping his small arms around her legs in a big hug. Seeing Damien's smile always made Linda feel a mix of joy and a little bit of sadness. It was a bittersweet feeling. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had become pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and in no position to raise a baby. So Linda and Jack, without a second thought, had offered to take Damien in. They said they would raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. Of course, the situation wasn't perfect. There were complications. One of the biggest problems was Damien's biological father. He was furious about the custody agreement. He felt he had been completely cut out of his son's life. Even now, 4 years later, he would still argue with Linda. He would accuse her of keeping him from his son. But Linda had her reasons. She had seen too many young fathers make promises and then disappear. She was terrified that he would come into Damien's life only to abandon him later. She couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of heartbreak. So she stood firm. She didn't want him around Damien at all. Besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough. In the last couple of years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. They were building a life together. And their plan was that as soon as Damien finished his current year of preschool, in just a couple of months, they were going to take him in and raise him on their own. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber. She had watched her granddaughter grow from a scared teenager into a responsible young woman. But at the same time, the thought of Damien leaving brought a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss him terribly. They loved him with all their hearts. In every way that mattered, he was their son. Linda could see that Jack was deep in concentration, focused entirely on the car's engine. She knew he didn't like to be interrupted when he was in the zone. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set the little boy down on the floor, and told him to go wash his hands and get ready for dinner. Then, Linda walked into the kitchen. She went into the adjoining dining room and casually dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto one of the chairs. The bag was full of that day's cash. Her plan was simple. She would take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda pulled out a pan and started cooking dinner. It wasn't long before her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms streaked with car grease. He walked over to the kitchen sink to wash up. While the water ran, Linda came up behind him and started asking him about his day. Jack just grumbled in response. He was clearly agitated about something. He started complaining about a customer he'd sold a car to the previous year. The man had bought it on a payment plan, but had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the man's house the next day and repossess the car. It was a hassle he didn't need. Linda could see how tense Jack was. His shoulders were tight, his voice was strained, but she knew it wasn't really about the missed car payment. That was just a small annoyance. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week, ever since he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid. He was incredibly close with his dad. In fact, Greg had been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding 7 years ago. But recently, Greg's life had started to unravel. He was going through a messy divorce. He was struggling with drinking and drug abuse. He'd been missing shifts at his job. Things were not going well for him. And so, earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm. He had asked Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on and he needed help. But Jack had decided to practice tough love. He had drawn a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act, stop the substance abuse, and get back to work. He wasn't just going to hand him money to enable his bad habits. This, of course, had led to a massive fight between them. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. And now, Linda had a strong feeling that Jack was genuinely worried. He was afraid that he had done real, permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was scared that their relationship might be broken beyond repair. And this fear was rooted in past experience. Something very similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis. About 7 years earlier, when Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into a terrible argument. It was so bad that Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda was sure that Jack was now terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. He couldn't bear the thought of losing both of his sons. So, while Jack stood at the sink washing the grease from his hands, Linda gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders, deep down. He was just going through a rough patch and needed a little nudge to get back on track. That's all Jack had done. He had given him that nudge. She reassured him, telling him he had made the right call. She said Greg would get through this and would come to understand his father's decision sooner or later. After that, Linda set the table and she called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock on the wall. She realized it was getting late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. She scooped the little boy up and carried him to his room upstairs to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas. She helped him brush his teeth. Then she tucked him into his bed, gave him a kiss goodnight, and quietly closed his bedroom door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Soon, Linda was in their bedroom on the first floor. She had turned on a small lamp on her nightstand. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. And within minutes, they both fell asleep. But several hours later, in the dead of night, Linda was violently woken up by a horribly loud noise. It was a deafening crack that echoed through the silent farmhouse. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, disoriented. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw a figure in the room. And she gasped. The next morning, at a church just a mile down the road from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children began to arrive, she noticed there was an empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't entirely unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led very busy lives. They owned a business, Jack had another job, they ran a farm. She just figured they were running a bit behind schedule that morning. So she started the class, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day's activities. About an hour later, at 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled. He was out of breath, his face was pale. He wasn't carrying his little backpack. And he was still wearing his pajamas. And then she saw it. There was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his pajama shirt. She quickly ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized with a jolt that the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, where his great-grandparents were. He looked up at her with a scared, confused expression on his little face, and he told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, was driving his cruiser down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years. He was the head of the investigative unit. So, when the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to investigate. The call had been routed from the preschool teacher. She had explained that a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, out of breath, and saying something very strange about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Linda and Jack Myers and gave the police their address. Now, Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could possibly mean by melting faces. He didn't know what kind of situation he and his partner were about to walk into when they arrived at the farm. But he had a gut feeling that it was not going to be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. It was a profound silence. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields stretching in every direction. Whitaker started walking towards the front door of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already standing wide open. He scanned the doorframe and the lock. There were no clear signs of a forced entry, no splintered wood or pry marks. But nonetheless, seeing an open door at a potential crime scene set off alarms. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully across the threshold and into the house. Whitaker began calling out, announcing their presence, asking if anybody was home, but his voice was met with only silence. There was no response. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door inside the house. This one led to a set of stairs that went down, presumably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now. Standard procedure was to clear the main living areas first. So, he and his partner continued clearing the first floor. They moved cautiously into the kitchen. Once they were sure it was empty, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when Whitaker stepped inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers. They were lying in their bed, side by side. And he could tell immediately from the amount of blood and the stillness of their bodies that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could see a large, devastating bullet wound on the back of his neck. As for Linda, she was lying on her back. She had multiple gunshot wounds, one to her face and another to her hand. It looked as if she had raised her hand in a desperate, final attempt to defend herself before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house, upstairs and down, just to make sure the shooter was no longer there. The house was empty. The two officers returned to the bedroom to begin the grim task of investigating the bodies and the immediate scene. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves. He gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on this, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for shell casings. He didn't see any. This was significant. It meant the killer had taken the time to go through the trouble of picking them up afterward. They were trying to cover their tracks to remove evidence. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. It was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. He saw that it was a piece of thick quilting fabric that had been wadded up and was covered in layers of masking tape. It was a crude, homemade object. His best guess, based on his experience, was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had likely taped it to the end of their gun barrel to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. And it must have been blown off at some point when they actually started shooting. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were so far out in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbor was a good distance away. But then, Whitaker left the bedroom and went up the flight of stairs to the second floor. He went into the room that was located directly above where the murders had taken place. He opened the door and found a child's bedroom. It was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at that moment that Whitaker had a chilling realization. The killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they committed this crime. They needed the silencer not to hide the sound from the neighbors, but to avoid waking the child in the house. This detail shifted everything. It meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This was not a random act of violence. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office began to arrive, swarming the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise the expanding scene. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over to look at something they had found. It was a set of clear footprints in the soft mud next to the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints. They led around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane itself had been carefully pried off and was lying on the ground, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the open space. He could see that inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. He realized this must have been how the killer got inside. And it also explained why, when they had first entered the house, they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to the couple. The killer knew the layout of the house. They knew about the basement window. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, they could figure out the exact type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The telephone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wires were cleanly severed. The killer had clearly planned this attack ahead of time. They had made sure that nobody inside this house would be able to call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the long driveway. A woman got out and started walking cautiously toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to intercept her to stop her from getting too close to the active crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars coming down the road and didn't know what was going on, but she felt she had some information that they might find useful. The neighbor said that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the vehicle, but it had stuck out in her mind because, as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized that this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially crucial piece of the timeline. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He was trying to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Linda and Jack. But that didn't automatically explain why. There could be any number of reasons for the attack. Maybe it was a robbery that went wrong. Maybe it was an act of personal revenge. He just didn't know. But as he began walking through the house again, he found that deposit bag full of cash sitting in plain sight in the dining room. This was a major discovery. It strongly suggested that this was not a robbery. A thief would certainly have taken a bag full of cash. He also noted that there were some fairly expensive electronics in the living room, a television and a stereo system, that also had not been touched. So, the robbery theory seemed to be off the table. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small, little red stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While the forensics teams were still meticulously combing over the farmhouse, another investigator who had been assigned to the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool. His goal was to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of empathy and connection to this little boy who at this point looked terrified and completely bewildered by everything that was happening. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic. But Damien was the only potential witness. He was in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. Speaking to him was the police's best chance at figuring out what had happened. So, Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside a quiet, private room at the school. He spoke in a soft, gentle voice. He asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, speaking in the simple, direct way that a 4-year-old does, said he had woken up around 8:45 in the morning. The house had been very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said that both of them were in the bed. At first, he thought they were just sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then he realized there was blood on their faces. He said he had tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes he found, but there was so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, in a panic, thinking he had to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile all the way down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was amazed that this 4-year-old child could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. But he was also very grateful. The child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's pajama shirt. However, it did not explain the other mystery, why they had also found that small spot of blood on Damien's own bed. So Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he had gone straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt there had to be more to the story. Otherwise, he just couldn't explain how a drop of blood wound up in Damien's room. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small figures. He asked Damien to act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien picked up the toy that represented himself and put it into the bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the figures for Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. He said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But then he said that later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just letting his imagination run wild, or maybe describing a nightmare he'd had. But then, Damien set the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his own fingers. He made his fingers crawl like a spider across the floor of the dollhouse, moving toward Damien's bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open. He had opened his eyes just a tiny little bit, but he didn't want to let on that he was fully awake. So, he was just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed. And the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien was so terrified, he said he slammed his eyes shut and just pretended to be fast asleep. And then, he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. It was too specific, too real. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holscher. The detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered it right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders. So, Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective would be standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this was going to be difficult, so he gently said to her that he needed to come inside and speak with her. Confused, Amber agreed and let him in. They sat down together in her living room. Then Burns, as gently as he could, told her that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. Where had they gone? So Burns took a deep breath, and he clarified. He told her that they were deceased. The word hung in the air. Amber looked completely shocked. Her face went white. The first words out of her mouth were, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. No, he said. He's alive. He's safe. But he explained that Damien was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were concerned that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to come back and hurt him too. And until they had narrowed down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, and that included her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and began to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his mind was racing. He was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as humanly possible. Every day that went by unsolved would be another day that this little boy would have to spend alone in the system without any family to comfort him after what he'd been through. Based on Amber's genuine shock and immediate concern for her son, and the fact that Damien had not mentioned seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect, but she might know something that could help the investigation. So, once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. And right away, she nodded. The first person she mentioned was Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. She told the detective that, in fact, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and started a huge fight with her right there in public about custody. The argument had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This obviously caught Burns's attention in a big way. It was a clear and direct threat. It also made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier path to getting custody of Damien. So he thanked Amber for her time and promised he would be in touch with any updates. As soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him everything he had just learned. Later that same day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they arrived, Andrew quickly came to the door and let them inside. They all sat down, and Andrew looked at them, clearly wondering what was going on. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched Andrew's face very carefully for his reaction. He seemed very surprised by the news, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew then freely admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family at all. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in the heat of the moment, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat, something he said out of anger and frustration. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious. His demeanor was off. So he asked him for an alibi. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder. And in the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house for a bit and then had gone straight to his job. He said they could ask all of those people and they would all confirm where he was. Whitaker wrote all of this information down. He asked Andrew a few more questions and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's apartment, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They went to the woman's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And then they also went to his place of work. And to their disappointment, everybody at all 3 locations confirmed Andrew's story. They all backed up his alibi. So, unless all of them were lying for him, it left no window of time where Andrew could have possibly driven 2 hours away to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven 2 hours back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like it wasn't going to go anywhere. And all the while, he was thinking about that little boy, Damien, who was all alone, waiting for them to find the person who had turned his world upside down. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother Amber, was sitting inside his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, the 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, a number of sheriff's deputies had fanned out and interviewed Linda and Jack's family members and friends. And several family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had dug into the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all. And there was no other current address on record for Travis. So, Burns basically had no idea where he was. He began to wonder how he was going to track this man down. He decided the best place to start would be by visiting Travis's younger brother, Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew from the case file that Greg lived only a few towns over. And even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, especially after so many years, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man wearing a baseball cap answered. He looked exhausted, and his eyes were red and swollen, as if he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised to see a detective at his door. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about the murder of his father and stepmother. And ever since that phone call, he said he'd just been sitting at home waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him. He'd seen enough TV crime shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. And Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here just hoping to get a clue about where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Up until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would go on to tell him that Travis had actually been back in Ohio for the past several weeks. He was staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns immediately thought the timing seemed incredibly suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had decided to come back into town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just felt too perfect. And also, at this point, it just seemed really strange that these two brothers were just standing there together, as if they were waiting for the police to come and question them. Something about the whole scene just felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them properly, they would actually need to come with him down to the station and do it formally there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Darke County Sheriff's Office and showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or even both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his own office for questioning, while Burns's partner took Travis into a separate interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in the chair in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was shifting in his seat, acting shifty. But pretty quickly, Greg said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was and what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that for the most part, he was just at home, asleep. That is, until about 4:30 in the morning, when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card back at his house that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. He remembered that the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, as Burns thought about it more, he started to realize that even if Greg's alibi were a little shaky or didn't check out perfectly, the timing alone likely ruled him out as the primary suspect. It seemed basically impossible for him to drive from his house at 4:30 in the morning, when he said he left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in at 5:23 in the morning, the time stamped on his card. There just wasn't enough time to do all of that. And also, pretty much everyone in the family had told the detectives that Greg was quite close with his father Jack and his stepmother Linda. Now, he was having some serious problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no prior history of crime or violence. None of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg remained a person of interest, Burns decided he would shift the main focus of his investigation to the other brother, Travis. So Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but that he'd mostly just been concerned about how Greg himself was coping because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken a single word to each other, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about the details of that falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. So Travis had just quit the business, packed his bags, and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if so, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made 2 mental notes for himself. One was to follow up and verify Greg's alibi, just in case. And the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up between his 2 sons. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left the room. He went right down the hall, and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns's partner would later say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the interview room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio after all these years. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently, and he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children, his own nieces and nephews. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing on the night that Jack and Linda were killed. And Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that alibi. Travis kind of hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his own office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different waiting room. Burns sat down at his desk and he began going over the evidence they had collected so far. Now, the investigation up to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of hard evidence yet. In fact, it had only been about 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for the results on pretty much everything, from the fingerprints to the ballistics. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go and follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they were the victims' children, and he already had a strong feeling that the killer had to be someone connected personally to the victims. And they both drove minivans. So really, either one of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's phone rang. He picked it up, and it was a local man. The man said he had seen a news report on TV about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that he thought just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man, who was talking to Burns, had asked his friend why he needed the gun, the friend had said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this. And as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence that would soon come back from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed. The first thing they did was put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with several items, a roll of duct tape, a box of trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of Darke County. They were calm at first, focused on the task ahead. But as they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned all of this out meticulously. They had prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked the minivan right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still inside the vehicle, they climbed into the back seat and grabbed their shotgun. They took the thick piece of quilting fabric and wrapped it tightly around the barrel of the shotgun, using the masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they went through these planned motions, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous, because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. They felt backed into a corner. So after their gun had its crude silencer attached, they slung it over their shoulder. Then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they used a tool to cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and mud, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. And there they were, sleeping in their beds. The killer took a deep, shuddering breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was so powerful that it blasted the homemade silencer right off the end of the barrel. It wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The wadded-up fabric and tape landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately, from the chaos and the noise, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer, and she saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. And in a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand, and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited, listening. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise could have easily woken up the third person who they knew was in this house. A person they really did not want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure they didn't leave any loose ends, they left Linda and Jack's bedroom, confident that they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside. They carefully walked over to the side of the boy's bed. They raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and quietly walked out of the room. Once they were back out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and then hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and they sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and the green jumpsuit into a river. And then they changed into their work clothes. They drove to the factory where they would clock in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew that he would stand to inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, so deep in his problems, that he decided murder was his best and only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23, just as he claimed. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The arrest happened so quickly that police were actually still gathering the evidence they would use against him. They later recovered the gun, the other supplies, and the shoes that matched the prints found outside the house from a river right near the farm. Fingerprints on the items and receipts for their purchase tied them all back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now a young man and is doing very well. Cases like this remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not hiding in the woods or under the bed, they're already inside the family. If you enjoyed today's story, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more strange, dark, and mysterious true crime stories, there's an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there, holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else, something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, "He said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back." "But Don, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out." Don was just as confused as she was. He said, "All right, that's weird." He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Don was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, "Go over it again." What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, "I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it." They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Don asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luoan village. Luoan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luoan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma King Mao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma Qingmao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma Qingmao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma Qingmao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma Qingmao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Mahfuk Singh was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Mahfuk Singh collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Mahfuk Singh had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Mahfuk Singh. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Malene. Malene was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Malene's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Malene were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding on to an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time. Hundreds of years ago, in the dense forests and rolling hills of what we now call Richland County, Wisconsin, a young indigenous warrior was walking with purpose toward the center of his village. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a proud and resilient people who had called this beautiful land home for generations. The warrior was strong and brave, one of the best hunters in his tribe, and he had been summoned by his tribal chief. As he walked, the familiar sounds of village life surrounded him, but a sense of unease hung in the air. He had a strong suspicion about why the chief wanted to see him, and when he arrived at the village center, his fears were confirmed. Standing there with the chief were 9 of the other strongest and most capable men of the tribe. They stood quietly, their faces serious. The warrior knew immediately this was about the 3 missing boys. 2 days earlier, 3 teenagers from the village, boys on the cusp of manhood, had gone out into the wilds on a deer hunt. It was a rite of passage, a chance to prove their skills and contribute to the tribe. But they hadn't returned. 48 hours had passed, a full 2 suns had set, and there was still no sign of them. Their families were growing more and more frantic with each passing hour. They had pleaded with the tribal chief to send a search party, their voices filled with a desperate worry that was starting to infect the entire village. The chief had initially been hesitant. It wasn't completely out of the ordinary for hunting parties, even young ones, to be gone for a couple of days. The forest was vast, and a good hunt could take time. But the families insisted they had a bad feeling, a deep, gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after 2 full days of waiting, the chief agreed. It was time to act. And so, here was the young warrior standing before his chief and the 9 other men. The chief looked at him with trust and respect and asked him to lead the search effort. He would be in charge of this party of 10, responsible for finding the boys and bringing them home safely. In truth, the warrior felt it might be a bit of an overreaction. 10 of the tribe's best men for 3 teenagers who were probably just fine, maybe a little lost or extending their trip to seem more impressive. But he would never question the chief's command or disrespect the family's fear. He accepted the duty without hesitation. Of course, he would go. The 10 men gathered their supplies. They took their most reliable bows, quivers full of arrows, and sharp spears. They packed dried meat and skins filled with fresh water, not knowing how long the search might take. They said their goodbyes to the anxious villagers who had gathered to see them off. The air was heavy with hope and fear. Then, as one, the 10 warriors left the village, following the well-worn path that all hunters took when they ventured out into the great forest. The lead warrior was a master tracker. His eyes could read the forest floor like a storybook. Almost immediately, he picked up the trail of the 3 teenage boys. He could see their distinct footprints in the soft earth, and for a moment, he felt a wave of relief. This would be simple. They would follow the tracks, find the boys camped out somewhere, give them a stern lecture about worrying their families, and then guide them back to the village. It would all be over by nightfall. But as they followed the trail, the story the tracks told began to change. The footprints continued along the main path for a while, but then they suddenly veered off. They left the familiar trail and headed deep into a part of the forest that wasn't known for good hunting. This was the first thing that felt wrong. The Ho-Chunk people knew these woods intimately. They knew where the deer herds moved, where the best hunting grounds were. The path the boys had taken was leading them away from all of it. It made no sense. The lead warrior kept his growing concerns to himself, not wanting to alarm the others. He just kept his head down, focused on the tracks. They walked for miles, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. And as they walked, he noticed something else that was deeply unsettling. The tracks never stopped. There were no signs that the boys had paused to rest. There were no marks in the dirt to suggest they had stopped to set a snare or stood still to aim an arrow at a deer. Their footprints just went on and on in a straight, determined line as if they were on a mission marching towards some specific, unknown destination. After hours of relentless hiking, with the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky, the search party still hadn't found the boys. They found themselves standing at the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. As they looked down into the shadowy depths, they all realized they had traveled so far off the beaten path that they were now in truly uncharted territory. None of them, not even the most experienced hunters among them, had ever been to this place before. They had no idea what lay at the bottom of the ravine or what was beyond it. But they knew one thing for sure. The tracks of the 3 teenage boys led directly down the steep slope and into the ravine. There was no hesitation. They had to follow. So, carefully, the 10 warriors made their way down the treacherous incline. When they reached the bottom, the dense canopy of trees opened up into a small clearing. And there, right in front of them, was the dark, gaping mouth of a cave. The tracks led straight to it. They went into the blackness, but there were no tracks coming back out. For reasons they could not possibly understand, the 3 boys had hiked all this way into this unknown place and had walked into this cave. And they were, presumably, still inside. The warrior and his men approached the entrance cautiously, the air growing colder as they got closer. Even standing right at the mouth of the cave, they couldn't see anything. It was a void of absolute darkness. It was clearly large enough to walk into, but how far it went or where it led was a complete mystery. They called out the boys' names, but only the flat, dead echo of their own voices came back. A heavy sense of apprehension fell over the lead warrior. He didn't know this cave. He didn't know if the boys were hurt or lost, or if something else was in there with them. A bear, a mountain lion, or something worse. He had to be smart. He couldn't risk his whole team. He made a decision. He turned to 2 of his men and instructed them to go inside to scout it out. The other 7 men would wait with him at the entrance. The 2 chosen warriors nodded, and without a word, they stepped into the darkness and disappeared from sight. The 8 men waiting outside stood in total silence, listening. They could hear the voices of the 2 scouts echoing from within the cave as they called out the names of the missing teenagers. Their calls grew fainter and more distorted the deeper they went. From the outside, the group could only see the flickering light from the scouts' torches for a short distance before they seemed to be swallowed by the dark. Then, at the exact moment their light vanished, their voices stopped. The cave went completely, utterly silent. For 5 long minutes, the warrior and the others stood there, waiting, their anxiety growing with every passing second. What was happening in there? The silence was unnatural. 10 minutes went by. Then 15. Still, not a single sound came from the cave. It was as if the darkness had consumed the two men whole. The warrior couldn't wait any longer. He told the others to stay put and carefully stepped just inside the entrance of the cave himself. The air was frigid. He began calling out the names of the two men he had just sent in. His voice echoed through what felt like a vast empty space, but there was no reply. At least, not at first. Just as he was about to call out again, he heard something. It was a faint sound, coming from deep, deep within the cave. It sounded like a low, mournful wail. At first, he thought it was a single voice, but then it seemed to multiply, as if other voices were layering on top of each other, creating a strange, discordant harmony. And then, with a sudden, chilling realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a wail of pain, it was a chant. And it was a chant he knew all too well. It was the death song. It was the sacred, final chant a Ho-Chunk warrior sings only when he knows he is about to die. The moment the other 7 men outside heard it, they knew exactly what it was, too. They surged forward to the mouth of the cave, their faces masks of alarm. "We have to go in," one of them said. "They're in trouble." Something is wrong. Before the lead warrior could give an order, before he could form a plan, 6 of the 7 men charged into the cave. Their loyalty to their brothers overrode everything else. They ran headlong into the darkness, their own voices now echoing as they called out, chasing the sound of that terrible final song. The lead warrior and the one man who had stayed back with him stood frozen at the entrance, listening to the chaos. They heard the 6 men running and yelling, their sounds mixing with the haunting reverberation of the death song. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The chanting ceased. The yelling stopped. The cave was plunged back into that same profound, eerie silence. The lead warrior and the last remaining man were alone, their hearts pounding in their chests. They listened, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. Just quiet. And then it began again. The rhythmic chanting. The death song. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a couple of voices. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices, it seemed, all layered on top of each other, chanting the death song in a powerful rhythmic wave of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The sound poured out of the cave, a horrifying announcement of death on a scale he couldn't comprehend. At that moment, the lead warrior faced an impossible choice. Every part of his being, every rule of their warrior code, screamed at him to go in there, to fight for his men, to die with them if he had to. But another part of him, a logical, cold part, knew the truth. Something evil was happening inside that cave. If he and the last man went in, they would not come out. Their story would die with them. No one would ever know what happened. And so, in an act that went against every fiber of his soul, he made a decision. As the death song echoed all around them, he and the other man turned their backs on the cave and they ran. They ran for miles, not stopping, not looking back, fueled by terror and grief. They ran all the way back to their village, arriving long after nightfall, breathless and on the verge of collapse. They found the tribal chief and told him everything that had happened. The chief listened, his face grim. He declared that at first light they would all go back. The entire village. They would go back to that cave and they would get their people out. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest canopy, a massive group assembled. The tribal chief, the lead warrior, the other survivor, and nearly 100 other members of the tribe, men and women, banded together. They marched out into the wilderness, a somber and determined procession, retracing the steps back to the ravine, back to that cursed cave. When they arrived, the cave was just as they had left it. It was quiet. The tracks leading in were still there, undisturbed. There were still no tracks leading out. Everyone they had lost was still inside. But this time, they had a plan. The lead warrior didn't know how they could possibly succeed, but the chief was confident. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady. "We will not go in as small groups," he announced. "We will not be separated. We will go as one. We will lock hands, all of us, and form a great line. We will never let go of the person next to us. We will walk into that cave together, as one body, and we will find our people." It seemed like a brilliant idea. There was strength in their numbers, strength in their unity. Nothing could happen to them if they were all connected. So, the great human chain was formed. The warrior who had survived the previous day was placed at the very front of the line. The lead warrior was second, his hand gripping the first man's tightly. Behind him, stretching all the way out of the cave, was a line of nearly 100 people, all holding on to each other. When everyone was ready, they began to move forward, a single shuffling entity stepping into the cold darkness. They walked slowly, cautiously. After about 50 feet, the cave passage made a sharp turn to the right. As the front of the line rounded the corner, they were plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. No light from the entrance could reach this far. The lead warrior couldn't see a thing, not even his own hand in front of his face. All he could feel was the tight grip of the man in front of him and the man behind him. He squeezed their hands back, a silent promise that they were in this together. The man at the front of the line kept calling out the names of the lost, his voice swallowed by the immense blackness. As they shuffled deeper, the walls of the cave seemed to press in on them, the air growing thick and heavy. And then they heard it. From somewhere in the deep, the death song began again. It started low, a soft, rhythmic chant, but it grew steadily in volume and intensity until it was a booming, deafening chorus that echoed off the walls and vibrated in their chests. Panic began to ripple down the line, but there was nowhere to go. They were deep inside, trapped in the dark, with that horrible sound. The lead warrior held on as tightly as he could, trying to be an anchor of calm for the others. He tried to keep moving forward. But then, he felt it. The hand of the man in front of him, the leader of the line, suddenly went slack. It just slipped out of his grasp. The lead warrior lunged forward into the blackness, his hand grabbing at empty air. The man was gone. There was no scream, no sound of a fall, nothing. He had simply vanished. The lead warrior was now at the front of the line. He wanted to stop, to scream for everyone to turn back, but he felt a strange, irresistible force pulling him forward, deeper into the cave. It was a compulsion he couldn't fight. And then, to his absolute horror, he felt his own mouth open. He heard his own voice, completely against his will, join the terrible, chanting chorus of the death song. At that moment, chaos erupted. The human chain broke. People screamed in terror, letting go of each other, turning and scrambling blindly back towards where they thought the entrance was. It was a stampede of pure panic in the suffocating darkness. Minutes later, the survivors stumbled out of the cave, gasping and crying, blinking in the daylight. The tribal chief, who had remained outside, rushed to calm them. He quickly did a head count, and his heart sank. Over a dozen more people were gone. They had not come out. And the cave, which moments before had been filled with screams and the sound of the death song, was once again completely, unnervingly silent. The chief now knew, for certain, there was an evil spirit in that cave, something that fed on his people. He made a solemn declaration. No one from their tribe would ever step foot in that place again. They could not lose anyone else. The cave was not a place of mystery. It was a tomb. And so, they sealed it. They worked for hours, rolling massive boulders, piling rocks and dirt, until the entrance was completely blocked, hidden from the world forever. Centuries passed. The story of the cave that swallowed warriors was passed down from generation to generation. For the Ho-Chunk people, it became a legend, a terrifying campfire story to warn children about the dangers of the woods. Many who heard it wondered if it was real, or just folklore meant to scare them. They would never know for sure. Fast forward to the year 1930. A man named Paul Seafort, a well-known antique dealer in Richland County, Wisconsin, had a passion for hiking and history. He loved to explore the deep woods, searching for indigenous artifacts left behind by tribes like the Ho-Chunk Nation. One day, while hiking far off any established trail, he came across a secluded ravine. He climbed down, and on the far side, he noticed a strange pile of rocks. It looked unnatural, like a man-made mound, covered in moss and overgrown with grass. His curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and started pulling some of the rocks away. He quickly realized this was no random pile. These boulders had been placed here deliberately for a reason. After clearing away enough of them, he uncovered what they were hiding, the dark opening to a cave. He knew he had found something special. It took a lot more work, but he finally managed to create an opening just big enough to squeeze through. He was sure that a sealed cave like this must hold incredible artifacts inside. He went home and gathered supplies, including a strong lantern, and returned another day. He squeezed through the opening he'd made and entered the cave. He walked down the initial passage until he came to the sharp right turn. He followed it, and soon the ceiling began to get lower and lower, forcing him to crouch. He was so determined to see what was inside that he kept going. Even when the passage became so tight, he had to crawl on his belly, pushing the lantern ahead of him. Just as he was about to turn back, thinking it was a dead end, he slid under one last low-hanging rock, and the space suddenly opened up. He stood up and held his lantern high. He was in a massive, cathedral-like cavern. The beam of his lantern cut through the darkness, and what he saw made him freeze. The floor of the cavern was covered with human skeletons. But they weren't scattered about. They were arranged in dozens of neat, orderly rows. And they were all positioned in the exact same way, kneeling, with their arms stretched out over their heads as if they were bowing or praying in unison. There were so many of them he couldn't even begin to count them all. He stood there in stunned silence, his light trembling in his hand. He slowly moved the beam of the lantern in the direction that all the skeletons were facing. And there, at the far end of the cavern, he saw what they were all bowing to. Carved directly out of the stone wall of the cave was an enormous, imposing chair. A throne. And the throne was empty. The sight of those kneeling skeletons and that vacant throne filled Paul Seafort with a deep primal fear. He forgot all about artifacts. He forgot about history. He just knew he had to get out. He turned and scrambled back through the narrow passage as fast as he could, not looking back, and fled the cave. He later told his incredible story to a journalist at the Milwaukee Journal, and it was published, creating a permanent record of his discovery. But the article, and Paul's account, left the world with two chilling, unanswered questions. What truly happened to all of those people inside that cave? And more importantly, who, or what, was sitting on that throne? We may never know what happened to those warriors inside the cave. But one question still remains. Who were all those skeletons bowing to? Until next time. Sometimes we look for solutions to our problems in the most unusual places. We might seek out a new technique to manage pain or a quick way to solve a financial problem. We do it because we think it's going to make our lives better, easier. But what happens when that so-called solution, the very thing that's supposed to help you, ends up being the worst thing that could ever happen? What if that fix, that shortcut, leads directly to a tragic end? Today, we have two stories about people who found solutions to their problems, but these solutions came with a cost that no one could have ever predicted. On the 15th of March 2011, just after 1 in the afternoon, 16-year-old Marcus Freeman was behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck. He was driving down a highway in Northport, Florida, with his girlfriend Carly beside him. A song he loved came on the radio, and he started belting out the lyrics, and Carly joined right in with him. They had just come from the dentist's office where Marcus had gotten some dental work done. His jaw was really starting to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that was hard to ignore. The singing was mostly a way to distract himself from it, and for a little while, it was working. But every time a song would end and a commercial would come on, the pain would rush back, and it was all he could think about. But Marcus wasn't your typical 16-year-old. He was used to dealing with discomfort, both physical and mental. He had been working really hard to become the kind of person who could push through pain. He was the starting quarterback for the varsity football team at Northport High, and that came with a lot of pressure. Over the past year, he had gotten serious about his physical fitness. He was doing these incredibly difficult, vomit-inducing workouts to get stronger and faster. He knew that physical toughness was part of the game. And then there was the mental side of things. Being the quarterback, all eyes were on him. The nerves before a big game could be overwhelming. He felt a general level of anxiety that a lot of high performers feel. So, he had started working with a school counselor to develop techniques to manage those nerves, to stay calm under pressure. So, dealing with pain, whether it was the ache in his muscles after a workout or the anxiety in his chest before a game, was something Marcus was actively working on. He was a very forward-leaning kid, always trying to improve himself. And all of this hard work seemed to be paying off in a big way. The Northport High football team, which had been terrible for years, was now coming off one of their best seasons ever, and a lot of that was because of Marcus's leadership on the field. But it wasn't just the football team that was on an upswing. The entire school seemed to be transforming. For a long time, Northport High had a bad reputation. The sports teams were bad, graduation rates were low, and test scores were in the basement. It just wasn't a great place to be. But now, it felt like gleaning corn had totally turned a corner. It wasn't just football. Other sports programs were improving too. Student grades and test scores were going up across the board. And maybe most importantly, the students just seemed happier. There was a better energy in the hallways. It wasn't just Marcus who was thriving, it felt like everyone was. And if you asked anyone at Northport High why this was happening, they would all give you the same answer. There was one person to thank for this incredible turnaround, their principal, George Kenny. Mr. Kenny had been the principal for about a decade, but in the last few years he had really changed things up. He introduced new ideas to the curriculum and put a huge new focus on providing individual support for every student. He wanted each kid to feel seen and heard and helped. And the results seemed to speak for themselves. The whole school was flourishing under his leadership. But right now, as Marcus drove down that highway, none of that was on his mind. The only thing he could think about was the searing pain in his jaw. It felt like it was getting worse with every passing second. It was no longer just an ache, it was a sharp, throbbing pulse that was starting to make him feel dizzy. But Marcus had been working on pain management. He had his techniques, the same ones he used to push through exhaustion on the football field or to calm his nerves before a big play. He was going to use those techniques now. As Carly sat next to him, he took a slow, deep breath and tried to relax his body. He tried to just breathe and let his mind go somewhere else, anywhere else but the pain. This was literally what his counselor had taught him. He would do this mental exercise where he would let his mind drift away from the physical discomfort, focusing on something else entirely. It was almost like a form of meditation, and it usually worked for him. He could find a way to push through. But this time was different. It just wasn't working. The pain in his jaw just kept hammering away, and he couldn't get it out of his head. Soon, it felt like the pain was growing, radiating up from his jaw, across his cheek, and into his entire head. It was becoming completely overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept trying to separate his mind from the pain. And then, all of a sudden, the throbbing stopped. Just like that, it was gone. And Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. While Marcus was going through this intense internal battle, Carly was in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio dial. She was trying to find another good song they could sing along to. Carly loved spending time with Marcus. She liked him so much that she had just tagged along to his dentist appointment just so they could hang out a little longer. She thought he was incredibly kind and funny. When she was with him, they could talk and laugh for hours, and it would feel like only a minute had passed. But as she was searching for a new station, she realized Marcus had gone completely silent. It was unusual for him. She looked over at him, and what she saw made her gasp. Marcus seemed to have gone totally rigid. His arms were locked straight out in front of him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. His head was tilted back slightly, and his eyes were starting to roll back into his head. He was staring up at the ceiling of the truck, not at the road. Carly started screaming his name, trying to snap him out of it. "Marcus! Marcus, what are you doing?" she yelled, clapping her hands and shaking his shoulder. But he didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear her. He just stayed in that bizarre, stiff state while the truck continued to speed down the highway at nearly 100 miles an hour. Panic set in. Carly was screaming, grabbing at his arm, trying to get him to look at her, to move, to do anything. But it was like he wasn't there anymore. It was like he was gone. Then Carly turned her head and looked through the windshield. Her scream turned into one of pure terror as she saw the truck was veering off the road, heading straight for a large tree on the shoulder. The impact was instant. And for Carly, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly's eyes slowly opened. Her entire body ached, and her head was pounding with a dull, heavy rhythm. At first, she had no idea where she was. Then she heard the steady beeping of machines next to her. She looked around the room. It was stark white. She realized she was in a hospital. And as soon as she made that connection, the entire horrible memory came flooding back. She remembered Marcus, the strange way he looked, stiff and unresponsive at the wheel. She remembered the crash, the sound of metal hitting the tree. As she was trying to process it all, a nurse came into the room. Carly's first words were about Marcus. "Where is Marcus?" she asked. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" The nurse had a very gentle, sad look on her face. And that's when Carly learned the devastating truth. Marcus was dead. Almost a month passed. It was April 8th, and Carly was back at Northport High School, sitting in her Spanish class. She was trying her best to focus on the teacher's lesson, but concentration was something that just didn't come easily to her anymore. Physically, her injuries from the crash had healed, but emotionally, she was still in pieces. Marcus's death had completely shattered her world. But maybe the hardest part of it all was that there was no explanation for what had happened. Why had he been acting that way right before they crashed? What had happened to him in that truck? It was a huge, unanswered question that hung over everyone. The official story in the media was that Marcus had simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly knew that wasn't right. She was there. She saw what happened. Marcus went into some kind of trance, and it was that frozen, rigid state that caused the truck to veer off the road at 100 miles an hour. There was no bad weather that day. There were no obstacles on the road. Whatever caused Marcus to freeze up was what caused the crash. But nobody was talking about that part. It felt like nobody even understood it. Of course, there were theories floating around, especially at school. A lot of students thought that maybe Marcus had received some kind of sedative at the dentist and had a delayed bad reaction to it while he was driving. Others wondered if he had just had some sort of random, sudden medical event, like a seizure or a stroke. But when the results of his autopsy were released, it put those theories to rest. There was no trace of any drugs in his system, and there was no indication that he had suffered a stroke, a seizure, or an aneurysm. So, those explanations were ruled out. Because the crash was considered a tragic accident and not a case of foul play, the police weren't investigating it any further. They had been at the scene, they had documented what happened, but there was no deeper investigation to find out why it happened. For Carly, this was a difficult reality to accept. She knew it was possible that she, and everyone else who loved Marcus, might never get the answers they were so desperate for. It might just remain a mystery forever. And it was so hard to go back to normal life, to sit in class and pretend to be a regular kid again, when there was this giant hole in her life that felt like it would never be filled. But Carly wasn't the only one grieving. Marcus had been an incredibly popular and well-loved student at Northport High. After their principal, Mr. Kenny, had announced his death to the student body, there was an outpouring of grief. There were memorial services and student gatherings. Mr. Kenny made sure that grief counselors were brought into the school to help students process the terrible loss. And so, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class trying to listen, the school's announcement system crackled to life. It was Mr. Kenny's voice. He said he had something to tell them. Carly could tell immediately from his tone that it wasn't going to be good news. Normally, Mr. Kenny was an upbeat, enthusiastic person. His voice was usually full of energy. But right now, it sounded solemn, and there was a slight tremor in it as he spoke. He started to say something, then he stopped himself and cleared his throat. And then he just said it. Another Northport student has just died. In the weeks that followed that awful announcement, Carly tried to make sense of how it was even possible. 2 students from their school had died in less than 2 months. This second death was different from Marcus's. It was self-inflicted. But still, Northport was a small, tight-knit school. This was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. It just didn't happen. But then, just a few weeks after that, in early May, Carly's confusion turned into complete and utter disbelief. Another Northport student died. This death was also self-inflicted. The news sent Carly and the rest of the already fragile student body into a state of shock. 2 deaths so close together had been hard enough to process, but 3 was just unthinkable. A dark cloud seemed to settle over the entire school. It felt like the entire student body was on edge, almost bracing for more bad news, as if more death was just inevitable. One night, not long after the 3rd death, Carly was at home in her room, scrolling through Facebook on her computer. She came across a post from one of her classmates. It was a short post, but when she read it, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it herself. The post pointed out that all 3 of the recent deaths had one very specific thing in common. So many people at Northport High, from students to staff to parents, believed that the school's recent incredible improvements were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. He was known for being very student-focused, for giving kids a lot of individual attention to help them succeed. But Mr. Kenny also had a secret. For the past 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been holding private meetings with students and staff members to help them with their personal issues. Things like anxiety, pain management, mental health struggles, trouble concentrating, or improving test scores. He was working with them one-on-one to help them become the best versions of themselves. And to do this, he was putting them under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite students, sometimes as many as 2 a day, into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions. He did the same thing for teachers who were struggling. He even sometimes brought entire sports teams into his office and would hypnotize them all together before big games to help them improve their performance. But there was a critical detail here. Mr. Kenny didn't just perform the hypnosis himself. He also taught the students how to do it on their own, how to perform self-hypnosis. The problem was, Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a very brief course in hypnosis. He had no license to be using it as a therapeutic tool to diagnose or resolve actual mental or physical health issues. He was not qualified or licensed to be doing this. But for a while, it seemed to be working. A lot of kids responded really well to his sessions. They reported feeling less anxious, more focused. Some of the athletes started excelling in their sports like never before. But along with these positive results, there were also some very alarming side effects. Some parents at Northport reported that their children started having strange personality changes after they began hypnosis sessions with Mr. Kenny. They said their kids would sometimes just get these blank stares on their faces. Others said that after a session, their child would seem disoriented, or they would start doing things they would never normally do. Some even began talking about hurting themselves. And so, after the 3rd student death, That Facebook post that Carly saw had revealed the one thing that connected all three tragedies. All three of the students who had died had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Ba. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore that he was not responsible for their deaths. But he was ultimately charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he received a year of probation. The Sarasota County School Board also paid a total of $600,000 to the families of the three victims. As for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. The solution he offered his students, a way to manage their pain and anxiety, had become an unimaginable tragedy. While that principal's solution led to disaster, in our next story, a man's own solution to his problems would bring him face to face with a consequence he never, ever saw coming. Shortly after 8 o'clock at night on the 9th of October 1996, a 31-year-old man named Anthony Irvin was walking down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was heading towards a local grocery store. It wasn't freezing out, but there was a chilly wind blowing and it was pretty dark. Anthony only had a light jacket on, and he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He pulled the thin jacket tighter around himself as he walked. All he wanted to do was go home where it was warm. But he couldn't do that. Not yet. First, he needed money. Once he had money, then he could go home. Anthony had lived a pretty rough life. For the most part, he was a career criminal. He hadn't held down a regular job in a very long time. Instead, whenever he needed cash, like he did tonight, he would either steal from a local business or he would mug someone on the street. Over the past 9 years, he had been arrested 8 separate times for crimes like robbery and assault. To the people in his neighborhood, he was mostly just a huge nuisance. Even if some of them felt sorry for his situation, he was still a problem. But despite how often he committed these crimes, they were always relatively petty. So, he never served very much time in prison. He always ended up right back out on the street, and he always ended up right back to his old ways. But tonight, as Anthony walked down that empty road, he wasn't thinking about how his actions affected his neighbors. He was just thinking about finding a place or a person to rob. And tonight, he decided he was going to look for a person. He needed a target. As he walked, he actually started to get a little worried. The street seemed quieter than usual. There was almost nobody out. He started to think that if he didn't find someone soon, he was going to be out of luck for the night. No money. But just then, he saw someone up ahead. A young man turned the corner and started walking up the sidewalk, right in Anthony's direction. He looked like a smaller guy, younger, and he was all by himself. And right away, Anthony thought, perfect. This is my mark. I'm going to rob this guy. So Anthony started walking towards this unsuspecting young man. As he got closer, he had a sudden realization. He knew this person. It was his neighbor, Harry. And Anthony thought to himself, oh, this is even more perfect, because he knew Harry. He knew that Harry was super soft-spoken and gentle. He was a calm person. He's not going to put up a fight. He's going to be so easy to rob. Sure, it was a terrible thing to do, to rob your own neighbor. Harry would know it was him. But Anthony figured, what's he going to do about it? So Anthony marched right up to Harry and stopped directly in front of him, completely blocking his path on the sidewalk. And then, Anthony delivered his classic, time-tested mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly was driving his cruiser fast down a city street. He had gotten a call about a mugging in progress, and he was hoping he could get there in time to catch the person responsible or at least get a look at them before they got away. So Kelly turned a corner and pulled up in front of the address he'd been given. As his headlights swept across the sidewalk, he saw 2 men. One of them was lying motionless on the ground. The other one was sitting right on top of him. And Detective Kelly's first thought was, perfect. I got him. He assumed the man on top was the mugger. He had caught him in the act. He was about to jump out of his car and make an arrest. But he was wrong. When Detective Kelly got out of his car and learned what had actually happened there, it would turn out to be the single strangest thing he had ever encountered in his entire 25-year career. So, when Anthony mugged people, he had a specific method he always used. He would put his hand deep into his coat pocket and press his fingers forward, making it look like he was holding a gun inside the pocket. He would aim his hand towards his target and say something like, "Hey, I got a gun. Give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you." And it usually worked. People would look down, they'd see the bulge in his jacket that they thought was a gun, and rather than risk it, they'd just hand over their wallets. It wasn't worth finding out if the gun was real or not. Anthony would grab the money and take off. He was thinking that this exact trick would work perfectly on Harry. This meek young kid would be an easy score. So he walks up to Harry, stands in front of him, and blocks his way. Harry, who hadn't seen him coming, actually bumps into him and seems confused. And that's when Anthony delivers the line. His hand is in his pocket, pretending it's a gun. "Hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot." But Harry, whether he believed Anthony had a gun or not, had no way of seeing it to confirm. Because Harry was blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind. They were neighbors. In Anthony's mind, that's what made him such a perfect victim. He was going to rob the small blind kid from down the street. That was his plan. But what Anthony didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. So when Harry was suddenly confronted by a man telling him he was about to be shot, his self-defense instincts took over instantly. He grabbed Anthony, flipped him completely over his shoulder, and slammed him hard into the concrete ground. The impact broke Anthony's neck, and he was killed instantly. And then Harry simply sat on top of his body and waited for the police to arrive. Harry was never charged with any crime in connection with Anthony's death. It was clearly determined that he had acted in self-defense. And even though the media at the time called him a hero for what he did, Harry himself felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He never meant for that to happen. He was just protecting himself. He later called the whole thing a tragedy. It leaves you wondering how many other solutions are out there just waiting to become someone's greatest tragedy. But after hearing these stories, you will wonder, how many times do we often trust something just because it is said to help us? And how do we know when a solution has quietly crossed the line into something dangerous? Currently, we are constantly seeking quicker solutions for stress, pain, and pressure. The real question is whether we are solving our problems or just handing them over to things we don't fully understand. Thank you so much for watching.